My son called me on a Friday afternoon. He said, "Dad, I want you to come to my award ceremony." I said, "Of course." He said, "It's next Saturday, the Meridian Hotel, black tie." I said, "I'll be there." He said, "Great." A pause. "Dad, just, don't make it a whole thing." I said, "What kind of thing?" He said, "Just come, enjoy it. Don't try to talk to everyone. Don't bring up old stories. These are important people, business people. Just be there." I said, "All right, Nathan." He said, "And maybe, don't wear that old suit." I said, "I'll find something." He hung up. I set the phone down on the kitchen table. I looked out the window. The garden was doing what it does in October, going quiet, going golden, deciding which things to hold on to and which things to let go. I thought about my son. I thought about the award ceremony. I thought about the Meridian Hotel, which I knew well, for reasons Nathan did not know I knew it. And I thought about what I was going to wear, not the old suit, something else. My name is Edward Calloway. I am 69 years old. I live alone in a house that is too quiet and not too big and exactly right for the person I have become since my wife Eleanor passed 3 years ago. And the Saturday, my son invited me to humiliate me in a room full of important people, was the Saturday the room found out what important actually means. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what happened, because the version of me that existed in my son's mind, and in the minds of most people who saw me that Saturday, and the version that actually existed, were two entirely different people. In Nathan's mind, I was his retired father, quiet, unremarkable, a man who wore old suits and drove a 12-year-old car and lived in a house on a street that was respectable but not impressive. A man who had worked his whole life in what Nathan, when he described it at all, called management. He was not lying. He was simply working from incomplete information. The complete information is this. I spent 41 years building a company called Calloway Infrastructure Partners. I started it at 28, with a second mortgage on a house I could barely afford, and a contract so small it would not today cover a month's office supplies. I built it from that contract into something that, by the time I stepped back at 66, employed over 3,000 people, operated in 9 countries, and held long-term contracts with some of the largest construction and development firms in this region. I sold my majority stake 3 years ago. I will not give you the number, because the number is not the point. What is the point is this. I sold it quietly, without announcement, without press, without any of the performance that some men bring to these moments. I had built it quietly. I stepped back from it quietly. Eleanor was sick by then. The money was not the point anymore. Eleanor was the point, and then Eleanor was gone, and the money was still not the point, and the garden was the point, and Sunday mornings, and the occasional call from my son that went shorter every year. Nathan knew I had sold the business. He did not know what the business was. He did not know what it was worth. He did not know that the company he worked for, Meridian Development Group, the company that was giving him this award for rising star achievement in commercial real estate development, had a contract with Calloway Infrastructure Partners that had been in place for 11 years. He did not know that the building the ceremony was held in, the Meridian Hotel, had been constructed partially through a Calloway Infrastructure subcontract in 2019. He did not know any of this because he had never asked. In 23 years of adult life, my son had never once asked me in any meaningful detail what I did for a living. I had tried, twice, to tell him. He had changed the subject both times. Not cruelly, not deliberately. The way people change subjects when they are not interested and do not yet know that their disinterest has weight. I had stopped trying. Eleanor always said, "Edward, he'll understand it when he's ready to understand it." She was right about most things. She was right about this too. The Saturday of the award ceremony. Nathan was ready. He just didn't know that yet. Let me tell you about my son properly, because this story is not simple, and Nathan is not simply a villain, and I want you to understand him the way I understand him, which is the way you understand someone you love and have lost and are trying to find your way back to. Nathan Edward Calloway, 41 years old. He has Eleanor's cheekbones and my stubbornness, which is not always a comfortable combination. He is genuinely talented in his field. Commercial real estate development requires a specific combination of vision and financial precision that not everyone has, and Nathan has it. He would not have the award if he had not earned it. That is true regardless of everything else. But Nathan had also spent the last decade becoming someone who was slightly more interested in how things appeared than in how they were. I do not know exactly when this happened. I know that Eleanor and I were not wealthy in the visible way when Nathan was growing up. We were comfortable. We were careful. I was building something that had not yet become what it became, and what we had was enough. And I still believe, that enough is not nothing. But Nathan had watched other people in his world have more, visibly more. And at some point, the watching became a standard, and the standard became a need, and the need became the specific quality that I noticed, slowly, over the years, the quality of a man who has begun to curate the version of himself that the world sees. His wife, Diane, assists in this curation. Diane is efficient and socially precise, in the way of someone for whom social precision is both a genuine skill and a primary value. She is not unkind in the overt sense. She is the kind of person who is always perfectly pleasant to the people she has decided matter, and carefully absent from the people she has decided do not. I had been carefully absent from her attention for several years, not dramatically. Nothing she said to me was unkind. But the specific quality of her absence was visible once you had learned to read it. Eleanor could read it immediately. She said to me, the year before she died, Diane has a particular image of what Nathan's life is supposed to look like, and I'm not sure we fit in it. I said, we're his parents. She said, I know, but I think for Diane, that's a category of person, not a relationship. I had not understood what she meant until the phone call on Friday afternoon. Don't bring up old stories. Don't talk to everyone. Don't wear that old suit. Don't remind anyone who you are, because who you are is not who Nathan needs you to be in this room. I had understood then. I had heard it in everything he didn't say. He wasn't inviting me to celebrate. He was inviting me to be managed, to be present in a contained and controlled way that served the image without disrupting it. To be, for one evening, the unremarkable retired father from the house on the respectable but not impressive street. What he did not know was that I had spent 41 years being precisely who I needed to be in precisely the moment that required it. And this moment required something specific. I went to my wardrobe, not the old suit. I called my tailor. I have a tailor named Mr. Patel. I have had Mr. Patel for 22 years. He works from a small shop that has occupied the same address since 1987, and that looks from the outside like the kind of place you drive past rather than enter, which suits the people who use it, most of whom have the same preference for discretion in professional matters. I called him on Friday evening. I said, Mr. Patel, I need something for Saturday evening. Black tie. He said, Mr. Calloway, it is Friday. I said, I know. He said, Saturday is tomorrow. I said, I know. There was a pause. Then he said, come in at 8 in the morning. I went at 8 in the morning. He had 3 things ready: the suit itself, a shirt, and a set of cufflinks that Eleanor had given me on our 30th anniversary. I had not worn any of it since Eleanor's funeral. I had not been certain I would wear any of it again. Mr. Patel made 3 small adjustments over 2 hours. He worked in near silence, which is why I have used him for 22 years. When he was done, he looked at me the way he looks at finished work. He said, "Very good." I said, "Thank you, Mr. Patel." He said, "The occasion is important." I said, "My son is receiving an award." He said, "You must be very proud." I said, "I am." I said it and I meant it. Both things were true simultaneously. The pride was real. What was also real was what I was walking into. I drove home. I set the suit on the back of the chair in the bedroom. Eleanor's photograph is on the dresser, the one from the year we got married, which I keep there not out of sentimentality, though the sentimentality is real, but because it is the best photograph ever taken of her, and she would have been annoyed if I kept it in a drawer. I looked at her photograph for a moment. I said, "Come with me on Saturday." She would have had opinions about Saturday, specific and useful ones. I looked at the suit. I looked at her photograph. I went to bed at 10 o'clock. I was ready. I arrived at the Meridian Hotel at 6:55. The ceremony was at 7. The Meridian is a good building. It was built in 2019, which means I watched it go up from the ground level and made certain decisions about it that I will explain shortly. It has the specific quality of a building that was designed to suggest permanence, high ceilings, materials that cost what they cost, because someone understood that the materials in a building communicate something about the building's owners. I know all of this, because I know who built it. I parked in the structure adjacent to the hotel. I walked through the main entrance. The lobby was set for the event. Meridian Development Group's annual Excellence Awards, which was a function I had attended before, in a different capacity, in a different role, at a time when Nathan had not yet been employed there and would not have recognized me at this function if I had walked past him. This was information Nathan did not have. I checked in at the registration table. The young woman there looked at my name. She looked up. She said, "Mr. Calloway." Of course. Something in her recognition was slightly more than the recognition due to a guest's name on a list, but she was professional and did not elaborate. I was shown to the table assigned to Nathan's family. Nathan was already at the main table with the other award recipients, across the room. He saw me arrive. He looked at the suit. Something crossed his face, surprise, and then a kind of recalculation, and then a settling back into the managed expression he had been wearing all evening. He did not come over. Diane was at the family table. She looked at me when I sat down. She had the expression of someone who has done the seating arrangement calculations and is doing them again rapidly with new information. She said, "Edward, you look well." I said, "Thank you, Diane." She said, Is that a new suit?" I said, "Mr. Patel made some adjustments." She said, "Right. The specific right of someone who is storing information for later consideration." The other people at the table were Diane's sister, her sister's husband, and 2 colleagues of Nathan's with their wives. They were polite. They were the polite of people who are allocating appropriate attention to each element of the evening and had allocated a specific amount to Nathan's father before moving on. Dinner was served. The conversation at the table was the conversation of people who work in the same industry, in the same city, and have been to enough of these events to know how to maintain it without effort. Development, projects, values, markets. I listened. I ate. I said nothing that drew attention, and then the program began. The MC was a man named Gerald Foster. I knew Gerald Foster, not well, but from the years when Callaway Infrastructure was active in this market and the relevant people in the adjacent industries knew each other. He was polished and competent and had the specific ease of someone who has run 100 of these evenings and has decided to enjoy them. He welcomed the room. He went through the award categories. He built the preamble with the skill of someone who understands that the preamble is actually the product and the award itself is merely the conclusion. And then he came to Nathan's category. rising star in commercial real estate development. Nathan was at the main table with the other recipients, 3 of them, and he had the expression of a man who has prepared for this moment and is enjoying the preparation's fruition. He looked good. He looked, in that moment, like the version of himself that the evening's curation had been building toward all his adult life. I was proud of him. I want to say that again, because I mean it. I was proud of him. The award was real. The work behind it was real. Whatever else was true about that evening, that part was true. Gerald Foster read the citation, Nathan's contributions to the firm, the projects he had led, the development initiatives, the specific achievement that had distinguished him in this category. Then Gerald said something that I had not known was part of the program. He said, "Before we present the award, we'd like to take a moment, as we do each year, to acknowledge the people who shaped our recipients. Nathan, I understand your father is here this evening. Would you like to bring him up and say a few words?" The room looked at the family table. Nathan looked at the family table. He looked at me, and then, and I want to describe this precisely, because precision matters here, something happened that I had not expected. He smiled. Not the proud son's smile, not the genuine smile. The other one, the one that means, I have been waiting for this moment, and I have something prepared. He said, "Actually, yes, Dad. Come up." I walked to the stage. I was aware of the room, the way I am always aware of rooms, the arrangement of people, the attention patterns, who was watching what and why. Diane's expression from the family table, bright, too bright, the brightness of someone who knows what is coming. Nathan took the microphone. He said, "I want to talk about my dad for a minute." He said it with a warmth that was technically indistinguishable from genuine warmth. He said, "My dad worked his whole life, 40-something years in management." The slight pause before management was small enough that only I could feel it. He worked hard, he was dedicated, he did his best. A pause. But I think we all know that sometimes the apple falls a little far from the tree. Light laughter in the room. He said, "My dad is a simple man. He's always been a simple man. He's happy with his garden and his quiet life and his routines, and I respect that." Another pause. "I just think it's funny that the one night I actually need him to blend in." He looked at me. He looked at the suit. He said, with the smile still in place, "He shows up looking like he owns the place." More laughter, louder this time. I stood on that stage and I let the laughter finish. I did not move. I did not change my expression. I waited. And then Gerald Foster, who had been standing to my right and whose expression had been doing something complicated for the last 30 seconds, leaned slightly toward the microphone. He said, "Nathan." Nathan looked at him. Gerald said, "Do you know who your father is?" The laughter stopped. The room went very quiet. Nathan said, What?" Gerald said, "Do you know what your father built?" The specific quality of the silence in that room was the silence of 200 people who have just understood that the ground has shifted under an evening they thought they had mapped. Gerald turned to me. He said, "Edward, I apologize. I should have recognized you when you came in. May I?" I said, "Please." He turned back to the room. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the man standing next to me is Edward Callaway. Some of you know that name. For those who don't, Edward Callaway is the founder of Callaway Infrastructure Partners." A sound moved through the room. Not loud, the specific sound of recognition moving from person to person. Gerald said, "Callaway Infrastructure Partners has been one of the primary infrastructure subcontractors for major development projects in this region for 30 years. They have worked on projects valued at over $4 billion in this market alone. Several of you in this room have worked with them directly." He looked at the Meridian Development Group's CEO, a man named Arthur Brennan, who was sitting at the head table and whose expression had been moving through several stages since Gerald started speaking. Gerald said, "Arthur, Callaway Infrastructure has been a subcontractor for Meridian Development for—" "How long?" Arthur Brennan said quietly. 11 years. Gerald said, 11 years. And this building, the Meridian Hotel, where we are standing right now, was constructed using a Callaway Infrastructure subcontract in 2019. He looked at the room. He said, "The man Nathan Callaway just described as a simple man who worked in management, built the infrastructure that made a significant portion of what Meridian Development has achieved in the last decade possible." The room was completely still. I looked at Nathan. He was not looking at the room. He was looking at me. His face had the expression of someone who has been running a calculation for their entire adult life and has just discovered that every number in it was wrong. Gerald said, "Edward, would you like to say a few words?" I looked at Gerald. I said, "Thank you, Gerald." "No." He looked at me. I said, "This is Nathan's evening. It should stay Nathan's evening." I stepped back from the microphone. I looked at my son. He was still looking at me. I gave him the smallest nod. I walked back to the family table. I sat down. I picked up my water glass. The room began to move again, slowly, the way rooms move when something significant has just occurred, and people are processing it and deciding what to do with what they now know. Diane was not looking at the table anymore. She was looking at me. Her expression had traveled a considerable distance from where it had started the evening. Arthur Brennan left his table. He walked to me. He said, "Edward, I had no idea Nathan was your son. Why didn't you ever say?" I said, "He works for you, Arthur. He earned his position. Why would I have said?" Arthur looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough." He extended his hand. I shook it. He went back to his table. The award was presented. Nathan received it. He gave a speech that was shorter than the one he had prepared. He did not look at me while he gave it. After the ceremony, the room moved into the reception. Drinks. The specific movement of people redistributing themselves according to interest and opportunity, and the newly updated information about who was in the room. Several people came to speak to me. People I knew from years of operating in this market, some of whom I had not seen since retiring, some of whom I had not expected to see here. The conversations were brief and professional, and the kind that reactivate old professional relationships without requiring them to be anything other than what they are. I was pleasant. I was brief. I kept saying the same thing when people asked about retirement. "The garden is excellent." Most of them laughed. A few of them understood that I meant it. Nathan found me at 40 minutes into the reception. He came across the room toward me, and he had the expression of a man who has had 40 minutes to assemble what he wants to say, and is not entirely satisfied with what he has assembled, but is going to say it anyway. He said, "Dad." I said, "Nathan." He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked at my son, 41 years old. The award was in his hand, a heavy glass thing with the Meridian Development Group crest engraved on the base. He had earned it. That was still true. I said, "I tried." "Twice. You changed the subject." He said nothing. I said, "I don't say that as an accusation. People are interested in what they are interested in, when they are interested in it. You were building your career. You were focused on your own work. I understood that." He said, "I told you not to wear a new suit." I said, "I heard you." He said, "I told you not to. I basically told you." I said, "Yes." He said, "I was going to." He stopped. He looked at the award in his hand. He said, "I was going to use you as a punchline, Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "In front of everyone." I said, "I know, Nathan." The reception moved around us. 200 people in a room built by a company his father had founded, receiving an award from a group that had worked with that company for 11 years. And my son and I were standing at the edge of all of it, having the first honest conversation we had managed in years. He said, "Why did you come?" I said, "Because you invited me." He said, "Even knowing." I said, "Even knowing." He said, "That doesn't make any sense." I said, "You're my son, Nathan. You don't have to make sense for me to show up." He looked at me. I said, "I would have come if you'd invited me, and I was a simple man who worked in management. I would have come if you'd told me to wear the old suit and sit quietly and not talk to anyone. I would have come because you're my son, and this was your night, and I wanted to be here." He said, "I was going to embarrass you." I said, "You were. And then you didn't, because Gerald got there first, and because the room turned out to have people in it who knew me. That wasn't a plan. That was the world being what it is." I said, "But Nathan, even if it had gone the way you planned, even if the room had laughed, and I had been the punchline, and nobody had said anything, I would have gone home, and I would have thought, he's my son. He's having a hard time with something he doesn't fully understand yet. And I would have called you next week." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "Mom would have been so angry at me tonight." I said, "Your mother would have been angry at you for approximately 45 minutes. And then she would have made you tea and sat across the table from you and asked you what was actually going on." He said, "What is actually going on?" I said, "That's a longer conversation than we can have at a reception." He said, "Sunday?" I said, "Sunday." He looked at the award. He said, "This building, the hotel." I said, "Yes." He said, "You were involved." I said, "Subcontract. 2019, the Eastern Structural Component." He said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." He said, "I've been working in this building for 3 years." I said, "I know." He said, "And you never said anything." I said, "You never asked." He looked at me. Something in his face that I had not seen in a long time. Something that was younger than 41. Something that was closer to the boy who used to wait at the window on Saturday mornings when I would come home from overnight trips, and who would be off the couch and at the door before I had fully parked the car. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know you are." I said, "Tell me on Sunday, when you've had time to think about what you're actually sorry for." He nodded. He went back to Diane. I watched him cross the room. I finished my water. I got my coat. I found Gerald Foster on the way out. I said, "Thank you, Gerald, for what you said." He said, "Edward, I should have recognized you immediately. I apologize." I said, "It's been 3 years, and I was not wearing the old suit." He laughed. I shook his hand. I walked out of the Meridian Hotel and into the parking structure, and I drove home in my 12-year-old car. Nathan came on Sunday. He came alone, without Diane, which I had not asked for, but which told me something about what the 48 hours between the ceremony and Sunday had contained. He arrived at 11 in the morning. I was in the garden. He found me there, the way he used to find me there on childhood Sundays, coming out the back door and across the lawn, in the specific way of someone who has grown up in a garden and still knows how to move through it. He looked at what I was doing. He said, "The roses are late this year." I said, "The autumn has been warm. They're confused." He said, "Mom used to say that they get confused." I said, "She was right. She usually was." We were quiet for a moment. The garden in October, going golden, deciding what to hold and what to release. I set down my tools. I said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor and I had sat for 34 years of mornings. The same chairs, the same window, with the same view of the garden. Nathan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He said, "I've been thinking about something since Saturday." I said, "What?" He said, You knew what was going to happen. You knew I was going to say those things in front of everyone." I said, "I suspected." He said, "And you came anyway." I said, yes. He said, and you wore the suit. I said, yes. He said, why? I said, because if I had worn the old suit and sat quietly and not talked to anyone, the evening would have confirmed something you believe about me that isn't true, and I thought it was time for you to have the right information. He said, you could have just told me about the company, about what it was. I said, I could have. I tried twice. But Nathan, there is a difference between being told something and understanding it. If I had told you on the phone on Friday, you would have processed it as information. What happened on Saturday? You understood it. He said, there's a difference. I said, there's an enormous difference. You're a developer. You know the difference between a schematic and a building. He sat with that. He said, Diane she's processing some things. I said, that's all right. Give her time, he said. She feels bad. I said, she should feel whatever she actually feels, not what she thinks she's supposed to feel. He said, she wants to come, next time, if there is a next time. I said, there is always a next time. That's what family is. He said, Dad. I said, yes. He said, I've wasted a lot of years not knowing who you are. I said, you haven't wasted them. You've been building something. It takes the time it takes. He said, what are you actually worth? I said, that depends entirely on what you mean by worth. He said, Dad. I said, more than the old suit suggested. Less than what Saturday made it seem. Somewhere in the middle is the actual number, and I will tell you exactly what it is if you come for Sunday dinner every week for a month and ask me questions about the company and listen to the answers. He said, that's a strange condition. I said, I want you to know who I am before you know what I have, because what I have is not the important part. He was quiet. Then he said, every week. I said, every week. He said, Diane too. I said, if she wants to come, the door is open. It has always been open. He looked out the window at the garden. He said, the eastern structural component. I said, yes. He said, of the building I work in. I said, yes. He said, very quietly, I walk past it every day. I said, I know. He said, and you never said anything. I said, you never asked. He nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee. He said, I'm asking now. I said, I know you are. I said, I've been waiting for you to. There is something I want to say before I finish. Not about the company, not about the award ceremony, not about Nathan or Diane or the Meridian Hotel or anything that happened on that Saturday. Something about Eleanor. She would have known on the phone call, the Friday afternoon call, where Nathan said, don't make it a whole thing, and don't bring up old stories, and maybe not the old suit. She would have heard everything I heard in those words, and she would have had something to say about it that was specific and direct, and not unkind, but not soft either. She would have said, Nathan is frightened of something, Edward. Figure out what. She was always better than me at identifying what was underneath what. What was underneath Nathan's management of me, I understand now, and I understood more of it after Sunday, was something that is not unusual and not shameful, and is simply the particular difficulty of a child who watched a parent work for decades in ways he could not see or name and did not know how to ask about, and who filled that absence with the version of the parent that was available to him, the garden, the quiet street, the old suit, the routines. He had made me small because small was the size of what he could see. Saturday made me larger, but the size was never the point. The point is Sunday dinner. The point is the question I had been waiting 41 years to hear. I'm asking now. If you are a parent who has built something your child does not know about, I am not talking about money or a company or any of the specific things of my story. I am talking about the work, the real work, the thing you know you are that your children have not yet asked about. Tell them, not to impress them, not to correct them. Tell them because they deserve to know who you are. And if you are someone's child, if you are Nathan in this story, ask. Not about the money, about the work, about the years, about what your parent built before you understood that building was happening. Ask them while there is time to ask. I lost Eleanor 3 years ago. There are things I would ask her now that I never thought to ask when she was here. The most expensive thing is not what we lose. The most expensive thing is what we never thought to find. Nathan came for Sunday dinner, the week after, and the week after that, and the week after that. He asked questions. I answered them. We talked for the first time in his adult life about what I had actually spent my days doing. He had opinions, good ones, real ones, the opinions of someone who understands this world from a different angle and whose angle has value. Diane came on the third Sunday. She sat at the table where Eleanor and I had sat for 34 years of mornings. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She said, "Mr. Calloway, I owe you an apology." I said, "Diane, you owe me a Sunday dinner. That's all." She looked at me. I said, "The door has always been open. I'm glad you came through it." She nodded. She looked out the window at the garden. She said, "Eleanor planted those roses?" I said, "Every one." She said, "They're beautiful." I said, "They get confused in warm autumns, but they come back." She looked at me. I think she understood what I meant. Nathan came to the garden with me after dinner. We stood in the October light, going gold, going quiet. He said, "What are you going to do this winter?" I said, "The same thing the garden does." He said, "What's that?" I said, "Hold what's worth holding. Let go of the rest. Wait for spring." He looked at the roses. He said, "I'll come every Sunday." I said, "I know you will. I'll see you in the next one."